You're watching Deprogrammed. This is the New Culture Forum's latest show, devoted to fighting back against the forces of ideological conformity, particularly among the young. My name's Harrison Pitt. I'm a senior editor at the European Conservative, and I'm delighted to be joined today, as ever, by Evan Riggs, who is a freelance journalist and a man who will need no introduction, the highly distinguished historian David Starkey. Now, I'm interested at the moment, David. There appears to be a cross-party consensus that diversity built Britain. You have Rishi Sunak holding up the new 50p coin with bearing that inscription, and of course you have the reliably dim Sadiq Khan making this point, basically saying to Britons that, you know, immigrants built their capital city. Is this true to begin with? And if it's not true, why does there seem to be so much intellectual and mental capital involved in convincing us that it is true?
Well, of course, it's, as always, history being bent to fit the present. I mean, that's really what it is. As you know, the latest figures for immigration under a government led by Rishi Sunak are an incredible 600,000 in 1 year. That's a city the size of Manchester, a city bigger than Liverpool in 1 year. So this has got to be justified. That's one part of the story, one part of the reason for this. The other thing is, of course, the very understandable reason to make immigrants of all shapes, sizes, religions, colours somehow feel that they belong. And I think the latter has become very dangerous, because what it says is you can't, if you are black or if you are Indian or if you're Pakistani, you cannot somehow identify with this country unless you can produce evidence that there were large numbers of people who looked exactly like you in historic periods before. And of course, it just isn't true. It really isn't true. And there's a very different kind of approach to immigration.
You've given us two definitions of different immigrant attitudes. Could you give us an example of both types, please?
Well, the really important one, we've chatted about the one that says you've got to have people in the history of the country that look exactly like you do, or have exactly the same religion. The other one, of course, is one of the most, where I'm in the middle of a podcast, which of course I'm enjoying greatly now. The podcast that I've actually enjoyed most, which again too is trigonometry, with the wonderful Konstantin Kissin and, dare I say, sidekick, and that idea that you're one of three. And if you remember, Konstantin, who is of course Russian, did this extraordinary performance at the Oxford Union in which he talked about the West as his ideal, as the place that liberated him, that he wants to be. He came up with the brutal line that the only thing that we have to say about slavery is that every other country had it and Britain abolished it. And that's that very different sort of attitude that I think, I dare one say, the Good Immigrant wants to be part of this country, recognises, again, dare one say, that Britain is an extremely good place to live. Sure. I mean, why do 600,000 people want to live here? The answer is not because they've come to be oppressed. It's not because they've come to feel culturally alienated. It's not because we are systematically racist or they will be systematically disadvantaged. It's they think they will do much better here than anywhere else. And I think this is the real narrative that we should be pushing. Now, again, remember, you can play the game of immigration in very different ways. The famous remark that sort of everybody latches onto is Daniel Defoe at the beginning of the 18th century, who refers to us as a bastard nation. And he talks about the fact that, you know, we are Roman, we are Anglo-Saxon, we are Danish, we are Norman, we are Huguenot. Now, all of that is true, but A, it was a long time ago. B, in more recent history, the numbers were absolutely tiny. And C, and this is the really important thing, from that extraordinary fusion of Anglo-Saxon and French-speaking, the fusion of two dramatically different cultures between the Norman conquest and the end of the 14th century with Chaucer, you forge a remarkably homogeneous culture. And it's that homogeneous culture which, dare I say it, spawns freedom. Remember, England, between the 16th century and the end of the 17th, simply invents modernity. everything that we regard as a good thing fundamentally starts here. Now, if that's not enough for any immigrant who wants to better themselves, any immigrant who wants to enjoy freedom, wants to enjoy prosperity, wants to enjoy freedom of speech, wants to enjoy political rights, if they can't find something to be attractive in that, then why here?
I would have to imagine it's the fact that people think that they can actually, in this country, mold it a bit to become more like the country that they've left, whereas other places, even if they might have slightly less economic prosperity or be slightly less secure, are going to be less malleable. Why do you think people have been able to infiltrate, not only the news, but also, the media? I mean, we even see so many Netflix shows now where they've basically done a full-scale rewriting of English past.
It is an extraordinary mystery, isn't it? I mean, all one can say is that the key element of a thriving civilization, like a thriving human being, is finally confidence. That what differentiates a successful country from an unsuccessful country is finally a genuine confidence in itself.
So why did Britain lose its confidence?
It's a very difficult question to answer. Remember, this is not the first time civilizations have lost confidence. Rome lost confidence. And one of the greatest historical minds of all time, Edward Gibbon, devoted a lifetime to trying to analyze why Rome fell. I mean, can we understand traditionally, because medievalists and whatever get very excited about the Middle Ages, we do forget some absolutely simple, straightforward facts. It takes until the end of the 18th century for standards of civility, culture, the economy, life expectancy to recover from what they had been before 400. There genuinely are dark ages. Urban life genuinely vanishes. There is an absolute destruction of culture. That happened. Now, Gibbon's answer is one that's deliberately naughty, because
blames the Christians.
A bit like me, I suppose, really. Gibbon is denounced by the great Dr. Johnson, who's another extraordinary figure of this extraordinary world of late 18th century London. And Johnson describes him as the infidel historian. Gibbon is profoundly hostile to Christianity, and the central thing that he puts in the middle of his narrative of the fall of Rome is Christianity. That, in other words, Rome underwent a religious invasion. We know that the Roman attitude to religion is a very interesting one. There is, on the one hand, the formal civic religion of the worship of the emperor. Remember, the emperor is divine. The emperor becomes divine, and to refuse to offer sacrifice to him is treason. I mean, that's essentially why Christians are persecuted, because they will not worship an earthly god. It's
a similar reason why John Locke thought that Catholics wouldn't make good citizens, because they would have two rival sovereigns.
They would have two rival sovereigns. But of course, that was different in that even Roman Catholics didn't think the Pope was God.
No, indeed.
But I mean, that was a religio-secular. Well, I suppose actually the Roman one was a religio-secular dispute. But what Gibbon is essentially saying is that Rome fell because of a crisis of confidence in itself. What had happened was Rome had been interpenetrated by a multitude of religions. Again, Gibbon, because we were talking about neat phrases, Gibbon is a wonderful phrase maker, and he describes the Roman attitude to religion as follows: that in Rome, the people thought that all religions were equally true, the philosophers thought they were all equally false, and the politicians Anglicans thought they were all equally useful. I pointed out this seems to be the attitude of the king, as was demonstrated at the coronation, with the parade of mutually contradictory religions. And it was even better in Scotland when they included humanists as well, who, at a service in front of a king, said, "We all believe in human equality." And the king solemnly said, "Yes." the culmination of the absolute nonsense. But what goes on with that is the interpenetration of that Roman sense of civic religion with mystery religions, Mithraism and whatever. And Christianity is one of these. And it is profoundly subversive to Roman values. I mean, Nietzsche calls Christianity a religion of slaves. And again, this is also something very interesting. Historians, rather good historian, amateur, but a good one, Tom Holland, constantly argues that Christianity is the foundation of the liberal politics of the West. I think this is manifest nonsense. Christianity was totally happy with absolute monarchy. And indeed, it thrives in the Roman Empire via absolute monarchy, via the acceptance of Christianity by Constantine, by the emperor, or in Russia with the Tsars, etc., etc., etc. But what I think is much more important is to look at the actual chronology. That's to say, the fall of Rome in 410, the first barbarian invasion, the reign of Honorius, which is the moment at which the Roman legions finally quit Britain. And this triggers one of the great works of Western civilization, but also, if you like, the work that more than anything else marks the end of the ancient world, the classical world.
City of God.
St. Augustine's City of God. And what the City of God is about, Augustine is trying to say the fact that Rome, contemporaries say, that the reason Rome fell is that we've stopped sacrificing to the gods of the capital. We've stopped sacrificing to victory. We've stopped sacrificing to the god of war. We've then become victims. And St. Augustine denied that and said these are false gods and stupid gods. But he also said Rome was never really worth defending. He says that the values of Rome were false values, and indeed that there can be no absolute moral value in the earthly state. Only the heavenly city, the city of God, is a real city, has real justice, has real truth, has real validity. In other words, in one sense, he accepts the argument. He accepts the argument. And I think that between the two of them, Gibbon and St. Augustine, get to the truth. This is a very long-winded way of saying I think we're undergoing a new religious reformation. I think that we're or revolution. I think that woke and everything we associate with it is probably, it's either a new religion or it's a Christian heresy. And remember, it originated, although the actual language of woke largely comes from France. It's largely continental Europe. It's a bizarre mixture of German idealism on the one hand and French, sexo speculation, sociology and whatever on the other. We're talking about quips, as I always say, all bad ideas are French. But it's refracted through the America's torment about slavery and a completely different history and the treatment of black people. It's refracted through
different history from us, but not necessarily a different history from the rest of the world, or even indeed much of South America and Central America.
Absolutely. Yes. I mean, remember, Brazil is much worse.
Exactly, much worse.
The Portuguese export of slaves to Brazil dwarfs that. I mean, about 300,000. The Atlantic trade sends about 300,000 slaves to North America, to the north of 13 colonies. 5 million to Brazil, and of course, again, this whole absurd language of slavery being a genocide. How can a genocide then lead to the multiplication from 300,000 to whatever tens of millions are in America in the United States at the moment? So so it's this refraction of the continental idealism. I mean, this is my great quarrel. Like everybody else, I profoundly respect Roger Scruton, but it seems to me that he reintroduced into English conservative thought this element of Hegelian, of German idealism, which I just think is profoundly dangerous. We are an ultra, England and English conservatism is ultra empirical. It is totally ground-rooted. It is totally ground-specific. And of course, again, the world of woke is one that denies the existence of demonstrable truth. or rather, it claims to have truth by revelation. If you actually look at what's happened to our discourse now, it's become a kind of parody of religion. Twitter, with the limited number of characters you can use, looks just like a verse in the Bible. Words,
Psalms, yes.
all the Psalms, you can just practically see them numbered.
Unlettered Psalms.
And again, the way in which each word is parsed to find a profound meaning in it. This is not how language works. Language, certainly if you are an empiricist like me, language depends on context. And there's this, Twitter storms are invariably about tearing, do I not know, invariably about tearing a phrase out of context. Again, the idea of words carrying so much meaning that an individual effectively can be burned at the stake. That's cancellation. Which again I know from personal experience. This is a religious attitude to language. It's not a rational attitude to language. It's not a attitude to language which encourages debate. Remember, again, going back to the world of Greece and Rome, however much they all tended to become autocracies of one sort or another, still the basic culture of Greece, and then more specifically developed in Rome, was a culture of debate, of rhetoric, of what we're doing now, of language being used to persuade by fair means and foul within the political process. And it's exactly that which is now under attack, as it was under attack by the Christian church. That once you establish the notion that truth is a subject of creedal formation, which cannot be challenged, once you establish the notion of magisterium, that there is an absolute religious authority which determines the truth, there is no such thing as truth. It merely becomes a fetish. So I think that it's so easy to think of us as being a deeply irreligious society, which in many ways we are in terms of formal attitudes to God. But in every other way, it seems to me there's been this, as I said, extraordinary religious revival. I mean, it's not just in the things we're talking about. Things like Pride and Women's Day and this sort of day.
They've taken on a liturgical character.
They've taken on a liturgical character. They've even got a place in the calendar. We're all supposed to celebrate them. And what's going on now is just stop oil, just stop oil. It's like a religious procession. Soon they'll be flagellating themselves.
I think they've already started. Now, do you think that this religious character to the language that we're trying to work out online now, do you think this is indicative of kind of entering the fall of civilization? Much like the Romans, when they started arguing about religion, they fell into their fall.
Homoousion and homoousion,
exactly.
to take Gibbon's wicked explanation of the dreadful riots in the Second Rome in Constantinople. That is a possibility. Now, I am not a prophet, and I'm a historian, and there's nothing worse than even very great historians like Neil Ferguson with unfortunate tendencies towards prophecy.
You don't believe in applied history then?
I do.
That's Ferguson's favourite name for it.
It needs to be done. So, right.
Answer Evan's question.
No. It's a really good point. I think that that all political questions need thinking about in a historical context as one of the ways of thinking about them.
Sure.
You see, I believe that there are different modes of thought, and that one of the catastrophes that we've got ourselves into now is not simply woke. It is the notion of the expert determining public policy. Well, this does not mean I'm against expertise, I'm one myself, which is why we're talking about history. But the historical component can only be part of the argument. Yes. That is why I reject any form of historical determinism or anything of that kind of thing. But equally, we now see the disaster of a public policy which is driven by single issues. It came to a head with COVID. COVID again wasn't a rational response; it was a quasi-religious one. We treated the virus suddenly became like the devil. And quite seriously, it was that sort of absurd language. We had kind of do you remember, we had purification rituals, hand washing.
We had baptisms.
And indeed, but with purification rituals. I remember my friend Rod Riddle, who for once didn't display his usual good sense and scepticism, describing that he got chapped hands from washing. which is. So did he do it on his knees? Was he wearing sackcloth and whatever? But you can see that if you let public policy be determined by a single issue committee, like SAGE, the scientific committee, that had a single remit, which was to stop, if possible, a single death from COVID, you destroy the economy, you destroy education, you turn the National Health Service into a national COVID sickness service, and you go mad. And we've seen now the disaster of letting monetary policy committee be determined by the Bank of England. It's a single issue. The catastrophe of watching, again, we can talk about the other great religion, which is nature worship, Gaia worship, which is the oldest and most primitive form of religion, with people like David Attenborough as a kind of nuisance, Simon Stylites. If I could put him on top of a column and keep him there, I would. And the ridiculous Greta Thunberg, like some child saint. She seems to me to merit the fate of Joan of Arc, except it would damage the environment, I can imagine.
CO2 emissions.
Too many emissions. There must be a more ecologically sound way of dealing with
compost, perhaps.
Maybe, then you normally kill them first. Yes, we must stop being so naughty. But perhaps I am, as always, I'm doing a false staff. I'm leading youth astray. But you're seeing the point. All these things are quasi-religious. Well, they're more than quasi-religious. Yes. They are actually forms of misplaced religion. And again, this weird business that we want to bring back nature, as though man is not part of nature, as though we are not, in fact, what the Bible tells us. We are the masterwork of nature. And this, again, it's this extraordinary sense of the moment that humankind is the most powerful it's ever been.
We're written out of the script all of a sudden.
They're trying to write ourselves out of the script. I mean, the future historians, if indeed there is any literacy, any documentation, and anybody is capable of writing about it, are going to have a field day with the psychoses of the present.
Yes. I was taking it back a little bit, because I was very interested in the point you made about two types of immigrants, and I wonder if, in a certain sense, and I know you were half joking, but the immigrant we might call the good immigrant, the one who's enthusiastic about being here, looks at the place, thinks how lucky I am to be here, and and feels an instinctive loyalty to the society without necessarily having any ancestry here. I wonder if that immigrant is in many ways the exception rather than the rule, and I think this is true for of all people. Ancestry is naturally very important. I mean, and it has an emotional impact on our lives.
It depends what you mean by ancestry.
Can I give an example?
Of course.
I'll give an example, and it's one I've used before on the show, but I want to know what you make of it. When you and Evan as well, being a Canadian, go to the cenotaph, we are moved by that as human beings, but we're also moved by that because we have an ancestral stake in what that symbol memorializes. Whereas if we were to go to some memorial for the Chinese who suffered in the rape of Nanking, again, of course, as human beings we'd be moved by that, but we're not going to be half as moved as Chinese people will, simply by virtue of the fact, not because there's any kind of racial essentialism going on, but because we have an ancestral connection to the cenotaph in a way that we wouldn't have to that hypothetical memorial.
I have a remarkably ambiguous connection to the cenotaph. I come from generations of Quakers who were, of course, profoundly opposed to war. Yes. And my father was tormented by the fact that he was torn between his desire. He was too old to fight, but he was, because he was a machine tool worker, the factory that he was working in was turned over to the manufacture of munitions, and he wanted desperately to be a conscientious objector, but he had been unemployed in terrible poverty, 3 years in the early 1930s, which is not pretty, walking twice to London in search of work, having to delay his marriage for 7 years, biblical length of time, and he was torn on these things, and he was a tormented man for much of my childhood. So I have a complex attitude to that. Now, I rejected the Quakerism, I rejected the pacifism and whatever, but I'm still aware of that corner of my mind that gives me an intense ambiguity. I'm also aware that, and I know a lot about my ancestry right back, not terribly far, but to the 18th century, that all of my ancestors were at the bottom of the pile. And that again produces a different sense. Now, there are two ways that you can react to that. One is a sort of bitter chippiness.
Yes.
And the other is mine, which is we have always been a society, Britain has always been, England, supremely England, is a society open to talent. Going back to the Middle Ages, you think of the origins of most of the great leaders of the English church. They're not nobles. They are people usually of modest, middling background. By the time you got to my own period of history, the 16th century, look at the origins of a Wolsey or of a Cromwell, or indeed of the Cecils. They rise by talent, and what we then do, is one of the reasons we are so staggeringly well governed in the 16th century, you then create a general machinery for the recruitment of talent, which is called Oxbridge, and both what become the public schools and the grammar schools. And you also have, again, uniquely in Europe, you have a completely different definition of aristocracy and gentry, which isn't simply, it's this wonderfully ambiguous point. It's two things. It is partly ancestry. So William Cecil, I know the current Marquess of Salisbury reasonably well, and we giggle happily at William Cecil's desperate agonies to prove that he really was of distinguished descent. Cecil sort of labours to prove that he comes from one of the Roman tribes of Sicilia and all. Complete rubbish, of course, and vast expense spent on fake genealogies and coats of arms and whatever. So there's that desperate desire. So there's this double attitude to ancestry. Yes, there is genuine sense of ancestry, the great sense of noble lineage, the thing that the king stupidly rejected when he excluded the hereditary peerage from the coronation. I think an extraordinarily foolish and profoundly unhistorical, a merely destructive thing to do. So there's that on the one hand, gentility, aristocracy is indeed a succession of generations, which is reinforced by primogeniture, which is reinforced by strict settlement, which enables you to have the magnificent country houses, estates, and also a highly sophisticated governing class. But it's also about behaviour. And the phrase of Thomas Smith, who, by the way, is writing specifically in response to St. Augustine, and is also writing specifically in response to Thomas More. Remember, Thomas More's Utopia is an early 16th century version of the City of God. It's essentially about the rejection of England as a moral society. And Thomas Smith, in his De Republic, of the English Republic, although it's a crowned republic, in his De Republica Anglorum, what Smith is saying is that we are a society with moral validity, but he also gives this wonderful definition of an English gentleman, and he uses the phrase, we make gentlemen good cheap in England, that they're newly minted, that to be a gentleman in England, it is enough to have a degree from one of the universities to, again, listen to the point, live without manual labour and maintain the port and state of a gentleman. It's behavioural. See, it's a bit like My Good Immigrant. So do you see what I mean?
I see exactly what you mean.
I think that this, and again, I'm gay, so in all sorts of ways, and I was a completely unashamed campaigner for gay rights, way back when Ian McKellen was busy in the closet, because it was too, come on, let's face it, these were all Johnny-come-latelys. They come along the moment it's safe, and the moment they can make sure their knighthoods go along along with their comings out, and I have a degree of contempt. But I was always profoundly aware as a gay man that to an extent I'm outside the family, and that sense of family lineage and whatever. So again, all of these complicating layerings, but for me, there's that broader sense of belonging, which is fundamentally cultural, historically rooted.
Yes.
And that seems to me to be a genuine unifier. Whereas, of course, the attempt at pretending that there were large numbers of people of different hues and different religions is a false story, and you're encouraging people to believe false things. And I'm sorry, I really am old-fashioned. I believe there's a thing called truth. I know it's an awkward thing, and it's terribly inconvenient. It's terribly inconvenient if you're convinced you're a woman and you're a man, you know. But I do think it's truth.
If I may, Dr. Starkey, I mean, it seems to me that you are not a proponent of what we might call Whig history, that the arc of justice or the arc of history is long but it bends towards justice, right? But you're more of a cyclical historian. There are rises and falls to these civilizations, to these movements, to these religions. Do you worry that, you know, some of the aspects of the trans movement or some of the sort of gender hysteria that we've seen erupt over the last decade might actually contribute to a kind of reversal of the rights that gay people have fought very long and hard to get and are now actually being threatened? I think perhaps
for women particularly.
For women, yes.
For women particularly. Yes, of course. But of course, you see, I think it's the fundamental problem, and again, it's something we need to understand. Liberalism, and this again is a point that's understood by let me start again. It's conventional to assume that conservatism is merely a reaction to the French Revolution and that it's a form of reactive thought. I don't believe that's true. I think English conservatism is the authentic strand of English culture. It goes right back to a figure like John Fortescue in the 15th century, who was, and again, the interesting notion of freedom and prosperity as contrasted with French absolutism and the poverty of the people and the obscene wealth of the monarchy and the governing class. That's all there. I mean, how can you not be a conservative country when you reverse a revolution? Remember, we did the most extraordinary thing of any country, that without external intervention, we deliberately reverse a revolution.
We rolled the clock back 11 years.
Thoroughly.
In 1660. Is that what you're talking? You're talking about the Restoration?
I'm talking about. Well, it's a complex process. It's 1660 to
and then
1689.
1889. Yes.
But you deliberately undo a revolution. You create a different political settlement, but it's one that's firmly rooted in a past and whatever. So there's that very long tradition. But if we go back to Burke, then Burke, I think, is really reasserting. He's not inventing, as is conventionally said. He is reasserting A, the continuity of that culture, B, the fact that English freedoms are historically rooted, i.e. go back a very long way. But also he is pointing out what the essential problem with the French Revolution is. The essential problem with the French Revolution and all liberalism is that it starts with the abstract rather than the concrete, that it starts with the universal rather than the particular. And I'm afraid the only possible outcome of it, and this is a terrible thing to say, liberalism naturally leads to tyranny and to destruction. It seems to me there is no accident, and Burke says this perfectly clearly, there is no accident about the outcome of the French Revolution. Remember, what's so astonishing about the Reflections is, written right at the beginning, it predicts everything. It predicts the terror. It was
published in November 1790.
Exactly.
And the terror comes in later.
Well, it's not only that. He predicts Napoleon. He predicts a military dictatorship. Military dictatorship. He predicts social disintegration, and he does it all on, if you like, I mean, arguing against principles. He does it all on first principles. He says that if you begin with rootless reason,
yes,
this is what inevitably happens. And again, I'm very interested in your question. If I look at my younger self, if I look at the self that first, I suppose, became quite famous in the 1990s, I was a thoroughgoing libertarian, and I used to say things like that I was torn politically because Margaret Thatcher believed in economic liberalism and the left believed in social liberalism, and what I wanted was the two together. And then I suppose, as things began to change and the ground shifted and gave way beneath your feet, I became aware that was foolish and shallow. Very understandable, and particularly if one
in your
comes,
context,
in my context, my sort of background, my kind of sexual experience, I've been moved on by the police. I've had some thug of a police constable on Hampstead Heath. We won't.
I noticed when you said constable, you emphasised the first syllable.
Yeah. Oh, indeed, yes. Naughty boy. All of that. But I became aware that this wasn't satisfactory. So I've been on a kind of voyage from libertarianism to a much more grounded understanding of conservatism.
And of the freedoms which you valued as a libertarian.
Are in fact rooted in conservatism.
Exactly.
You see, this is the paradox, and this is where the whole Whig teaching of history gets it wrong. There was this terrible exhibition at the British Library, fronted by Linda Colley, on Magna Carta, that presents this irresistible movement towards freedom. Actually, there's no irresistible movement towards freedom. The essential principles are there pretty much from the beginning. What you see is a broadening. And what is, again, anybody looking at British and particularly English history up to the 20th century is struck by one thing. Yes, there are radical movements. Of course there are. There are the Chartists, there are the struggles for the representation of the working man. Many of my ancestors being involved in all of these, votes for women and whatever. But what they're all wanting to do isn't tear the structure down, they're wanting to become part of it. And what is moreover is extraordinary is that the English upper class had the wisdom to do it. I mean, yes, there are struggles. The extraordinary tearing itself apart, the tearing of the upper classes and the Tory party in particular apart in the 1830s. Again, the renewed struggles of the late 19th century. All the tensions over particularly the first Reform Act.
Particularly when you compare it to the continent as well. I mean, in 1848, the continent was erupted in the spring times of peoples, whereas Britain just had three not reasonably quiet Reform Acts throughout that century.
That's right.
In which the franchise there was upheaval,
but it was all dealt with within the constitutional process.
Exactly.
And dare one say it? I mean, a degree of riot formed part of the constitutional process.
And different parties were involved in it as well. So you had Earl Grey, then Disraeli, and then
Disraeli is the one who, again, because he was a gambler, actually takes the biggest gamble of the lot, which everybody realised, which is in 1867 to give the vote to the ordinary working man. That what 1832 does is to produce the kind of electorate which Emily Maitlis would be happy with, an upper class educated electorate that leads to a permanent liberal majority. Exactly the sort of thing that enables Hugh Edwards to flourish in all his wonderful variety. Whereas it's Disraeli Disraeli takes the Boris Johnson gamble. He takes the gamble that and I think it's the right gamble, that the British working man was patriotic, dare one say it, also jingoistic, and of course he rides that and rides it with spectacular success. And it's also Disraeli who is absolutely clear, exactly like Burke, that liberalism is the enemy. But he does it in a very interesting way. He says, again, Disraeli on conservatism is fascinating. He says, Britain is a naturally progressive country. Of course it is. He understood that. The Victorian age is the most gigantic, I think in many ways, much bigger age of change than our own. But what he says is there are two different ways of changing. This is the thing that we should all be putting into mind. There's a way of changing which is you deliberately do it according to universal principles. That's the liberal way. On the other hand, there is the conservative way in which you build organically on what is there and adapt that to circumstance. And what is fascinating is looking back at Blair and New Labour and the utter catastrophes of New Labour's constitutional reforms. They were all grounded on liberal universalism. The notion that we had to abolish the office of Lord Chancellor because it defied the separation of powers. The separation of powers is a piece of inanity, French, of course, Montesquieu, based on a complete misunderstanding of the English constitution. He lived in England for a couple of years. He spoke no English whatever, he moved in a circle of entirely French-speaking radicals, people like Bolingbroke and whatever, and he gets his ideas, totally false ideas, of the English Constitution from Bolingbroke, whatever it is, Patriot King or whatever.
The idea of a Patriot King.
The idea of a Patriot King. He gets it from that, which is an absurd parody of the English Constitution. How can you have a separation of powers when the English Constitution depends on the executive sitting in the representative assembly in Parliament and having a working majority in it? This is why the English Parliament survives. Remember, again, the progressive narrative sees Parliament as a development. It isn't. Parliament exists essentially in its modern form by the end of the reign of Edward I. Right? What is peculiar about the English Parliament isn't that it is some sort of great novel development of liberalism. It's that this strange thing survives at all, and it only survives partly by accident, but also because first in the Middle Ages and then in the 18th century, Parliament was useful. The reason that Edward I, who had been the great opponent of Simon de Montfort, the reason that Edward I accepts Parliament is it's the best way of getting money out of people. They discover that this is extraordinary English, and this is the origins of English politeness, that it's much more sensible to ask people nicely before you tax them, rather than just to go in like the French with a pitchfork and try to steal their goods, which is essentially what the French absolute monarchy did. So it's this very, very different approach. And again, from the 18th century onwards, of course, it's precisely the deal between Crown and Parliament that leads to the gigantic explosion of English power, because you come up with a new way of managing Parliament and indeed managing the King in this strange office of Prime Minister. The office of Prime Minister manages Parliament on behalf of the King, but it also manages the King on behalf of Parliament. That's this extraordinary median job, because remember, all European countries have had various forms of representative assembly. They're abolished because they just get in the way of good government. They behave like the French National Assembly did for most of its time, just absurd. And they got rid of. The English Parliament survives because it's functionally useful. And the period of the great conflict in Parliament, the late 16th and the early 17th century, is when Parliament ceases to be useful. And instead you just get the clash.
So you're talking just after the 1688 revolution, into Queen Anne.
Parliament. What happens is that after 1689, there is a period of intense party strife, of course, as we all know, which really culminates in the last time that you used impeachment against a fallen minister with the Earl of Oxford after he had brought about peace with France, the treaties with Utrecht. The treaties of Utrecht, and then the complete overthrow of that by the Hanoverian accession. But what you then do in the early 18th century, the Office of Parliament, in other words, 1720s with Walpole, you develop this new method of parliamentary management, which is what the Office of Prime Minister is. And I've just walked through the area that bases that is the physical testimony to this. The old Royal Palace of Whitehall burns out in the 1690s. And then what you see developing in the 1720s, 30s and 40s are these new instruments of government which, as it were, express the power of the Prime Minister. And so you see the building of the Treasury, you see building of Downing Street given to Walpole in 1737, you see Horse Guards, you see the Admiralty, and all of these are the emanations of the new 18th century state, which is this new thing called a working, functioning parliamentary monarchy, which was what was so disastrously missing in the coronation, when the King decided arbitrarily not to have members of Parliament there.
Yes.
To bring things back to the modern day here, we had Peter Hitchens in that same chair last week, and I asked him, what hope did he have for the future of
the
young right wing? Exactly. Very reliably pessimistic. And I know you don't like to make predictions, but it seems to me if that England is the only country that has redone a revolution, that if there's going to be any hope for a kind of a right-wing revival in this country, they're going to have to do it again. That would be the cultural revolution of the last 30 to 40 years. Are you slightly more optimistic than Mr. Hitchens that this can be done?
Not in our current political dispensation. I think what is very striking is every other European country is actually swinging very firmly to the right. And I think they're doing it for two reasons. They're doing it, first of all, because you have a much easier definition of nationhood. It's Disraeli who says the Conservative Party is a national party or nothing. But I'm afraid in Britain the great question is, what? There isn't a British nation. That there was this desperate attempt.
A British nation.
There is not a British nation. Yes. There was this desperate attempt at trying to invent one by Gordon Brown. In fact, it was one of the. You had to be a historian to understand what was going on. But people like Linda Colley, David Calladine, Norman Davis were all really New Labour stormtroopers trying to, quite seriously, intellectual
stormtroopers,
trying to invent. Or indeed, Sharma with his history of
trying to provide historical justifications for what they already wanted.
For New Labour, and for a notion of a British identity. Remember, we define being British as being tolerant.
Yes.
It's the only form of nationhood which is the equivalent of a sewer. It's a kind of cloaca maxima in which everything flows, and there's no filter. There's no filter whatever. It sounds really pretty disgusting, and I think, frankly, it was. So there's all of that. And remember, this again, it's the paradox. One of the reasons we've been able to handle a tumultuous multicultural society is precisely because we were always multinational. That there was never a serious attempt with union with Scotland to amalgamate the two.
Yes.
There's never really a serious attempt at creating a single British identity. So there's this extraordinary vibration in the meaning of nation in Britain.
But is there,
and then just one second.
Sorry.
And then I'm trying to answer why. If you're Hungarian, you know you're Hungarian. If you're French, you know you're French. If you're Italian, bizarrely, though you get pretty confused between Milan and Sicily, you sort of know that you're Italian and whatever. It's very difficult here. So that's one element why I worry about the revival of the right. And the second is, and here again, I've been trying to be very honest in this conversation and explain where I've changed my mind and where I think I've got things wrong. I was one of those who led the resistance to the attempt at what's the word I want? At changing the electoral system back at the beginning.
The AV referendum, 2011.
2011, along with Matthew Elliott and whatever. And I was absolutely convinced by the arguments that two broad church parties are the way of producing political security and whatever. And what it seems to me now, the evidence is different. That both England and America are experiencing hideous forms of political stasis, precisely because of first past the post. And in America, of course, it's exacerbated by electoral gerrymandering and all the rest of it. Whereas continental Europe, bizarrely, is proportional representation, has multiplied political parties, which of course gives a proper opening to, as it were, political variety. It was staggering listening to the translations of the debate between the Spanish Prime Minister, Sanchez, and the leader of the main party of the right. It was, do you know what, they had different ideas. They had completely different approaches to policy. Yes. Whereas you've been pointing out, it's usually very difficult to tell the difference between Sunak and Starmer.
Santiago Abascal and Pedro Sanchez don't both think that diversity builds Spain, for example. Whereas in Britain, both, you've got Sadiq Khan and Rishi Sunak signed up to this new founding myth, which I suspect actually has some pretty malevolent motives as well, actually, because you've got to wonder what kind of person would you have to be to take issue with the fact that for 99% of British history, Britain has been a majority white country? What kind of person would you have to be to take issue with that? If I had some...
because we weren't diverse.
Well, exactly.
What is this? And again, this way in which all this nonsense has been bought into by the city. How on earth is the country which invents capitalism? Because that's what we actually do.
Yes.
Without the benefit of anybody diverse around the table at all.
Yes.
Though if you actually look at the founding court of the Bank of England, what is very striking is a number of Huguenots.
Yes, but they just come in though, of course, haven't they, in the late 17th century.
And I'm afraid they are white. They're also Protestants.
Yes.
Yes, there is a form of diversity. There's very considerable cultural diversity. Again, what's very striking about London's ability, always London, ability to attract Scots, Jews, Dutch,
merchants, enterprising people from all over the
Germans.
continent. Germans.
If you look at the great firms in the city, they're German.
Yes.
So many of the great banking houses, Schroders and whatever, they're all obviously German. Or you look at the world of Edwardian London, where the king was profoundly disapproved of by the high aristocracy. My friend Conrad Russell's last son, came up with, told me his grandmother, we can't go to court, this royal canaille, because what was the court? Well, it was the brutal terms of mockery. It was the Jewerage, it was the beerage, ennobled brewers, the great Jewish families, the landlords, the great South Africans and whatever. And what a wonderful thing, I think. But of course, what they all did, none of them came in saying, we want to preserve our differences. What they all came in was, we want to participate in this extraordinary opportunity, bluntly to make money, but also to enjoy the most civilized and the most interesting and the most varied of capitals.
Yes.
And very splendid that is too.
But this is the problem. The more you dilute what it means to be British, the harder it is to argue for assimilation, because then what are immigrants, new arrivals assimilating into if you've diluted that original core that you have? But this is the last question, which I'm very keen to ask you. Every revolutionary from Robespierre to Mao has acknowledged that in order to advance the total transformation of society, to administer your favoured ideological medicine, it's a pretty good idea to alienate people from their own history. And we certainly live in a culture in which people are severely alienated from their own history. And in many ways, what we would want, and what I imagine you would want young people to do, is to go and study history at university to feel. That's my question.
Taught by the kind of people who teach it.
That's my question. We're in a bit of a difficult situation, because on the one hand, you should be encouraging people to do that sort of thing. Yet I wonder if you're optimistic about the historical profession, and whether you think young people, either whether they're on the right or in the centre, reasonably apolitical, but they care about historical accuracy, should they go to these institutions, or should they learn history another way?
Well, the point is, of course, that the monopoly of the universities is manifestly collapsing, as I think the universities are. What we're doing now.
True.
The breakdown of media uniformity. What is now available. The extraordinary kind of polluted ocean of the internet, in which are the wonderful things and terrible things. And the problem is that we haven't really given young people, or indeed anybody, the tools to discriminate, because the tools of forensic reasoning, of empirical reasoning and whatever, are exactly the ones which are not being developed. The notion of debate and and how you prove an argument, and how you properly prove an argument, and so on. I suppose I have, unlike Hitchens, I still have, and there are moments when I have absolute pessimism. Absolute pessimism. I mean, reading the paper is usually a very moment in which one on the other hand, in a funny way, I think we should end by talking about the transcendent. We began by talking about the false transcendence of this awful parody religious revival, this what I call religious heresies of the new left, of the Marxist left and whatever. I think we still have enough of this country, of that sense of place, of extraordinary buildings, of an interwoven historical culture. I hope for that. I mean, the thing that I suppose has influenced me most in thinking about all of this have been the work of people like T.S. Eliot, the Four Quartets, that extraordinary little Gidding, the one which is History is Now in England. And I think history can, and the continued huge popular fascination with it, good, bad and indifferent, I think history in England in particular is a form of transcendence. I think it is our real, in the proper sense of transcendence, it is both the grounding and the destination. And I'm sorry to end in equally muddied, equally mysterious terms as I've been denouncing on behalf of our opponents, but that standing in a quiet country church in the silence, and yet you hear bizarrely the noise of the past. And that's what Eliot's invoking. Those feet which have trodden there, those deeds which have been done there. And here, in the heart of this city, in the heart of Westminster, there's another kind of transcendence. You go into the Abbey, despite what the clergy of the Abbey have sort of done. You go into St. Paul's, where the attack has been much more radical, and you still feel it. And that, as much as words, as much as anything we can do, is where there might be hope.
There may yet be hope for a British restoration. Well, Dr. David Starkey, it's been a privilege to sit down with you and to discuss all these matters. Evan, thanks as ever. You've been watching Deprogrammed. Make sure to like, subscribe, leave a comment, and we shall see you on the next one.
Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.